Okay, well, tonight we have Father Raymond here, who's going to give the final speech on our lecture on economics, work economics in Christianity, and it's going to be sort of the pinnacle. He's going to be talking primarily about charity, um, and I occasionally lecture on economics as well, and I often ask my students or who are in the room, and I say, "What do you think that love has anything to do with economics?" And most of the time, they look at me with a blank face, even more blank than when I'm normally lecturing. And they're saying, well, I don't understand at all that question. It doesn't compute at all. And what I try to tell them and what I try to do throughout it is to say, and to use, and to borrow it, I know we have a priest here, but I'm going to quote from a rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. Some of you may know who he is. And he talks about human beings as intrinsically creatures who require meaning in order to live. And he has a wonderful little lecture where he's talking about making sense of the world. And he says, meaning can never come and can never be understood from within the system itself. And he talks about how chess, if you're trying to understand or teach somebody from outside who has never seen a chessboard before, that they'll need some sort of exterior, some sort of understanding of meaning that comes outside of the game of chess itself. And he said that the meaning for the system cannot be found inside the system. And he goes on to make a case for the role of faith writ large on that. But I think it's also true for our economic system that the meaning of it cannot come from within it. It's got to come from somewhere else, and it has to have the greatest source of meaning that's derived from some other place. And I think that what Father Raymond has done for us is explain and help us understand to a greater extent the way in which our economic system is shot through with meaning. And for tonight's lecture on charity and economics, I hope that he's going to take us right to the very top of that mountain. So please join me in welcoming Father Raymond to this.
I've got mine. Good. Well, thank you, Renze. Thank you, Brian. So if you're paying attention, what Brian was saying is that when his lectures are finished, the students have a more blank expression than at the beginning. So we're going to try and reverse that. Anyway, thank you all for coming again. So if you're here, remember last time I said if you came to all 4 lectures, you get $1,000. Remember I said that? And then Renza was off to the side. He was getting very nervous about that. So I said, well, it'd be $10 a year for 100 years. I did say that. It's on the recorded transcript. He checked actually. So I have $10 right here. So who came to all 4? We'll give it to. He came from a further distance. Monica doesn't even qualify because she's working. But you can. There you go. He's from Kempville. There you go. There you go. Everybody else, see Ren's at the back. Get your $10. Come back next year. Get your next $10. And I want to show them a man of my word there. So the 4 topics we looked at, first one in our sort of a Christian approach to economics was on work. The second one was on liberty. The third one was on virtue. And this one, as Brian mentioned, is on charity. And that question that he posed is a very good one. What does economics have to do with charity? Or if you want to put it the other way around, in honor of Tina Turner, who just died, what's love got to do with it? If you remember that song from her 1985 album, I actually saw her perform in Calgary as a teenager twice. And then I realized Tina Turner was the same age as my mother. And so I stopped. I could listen, but I couldn't watch her anymore after that because there's something strange about watching a woman of the same age as your mother presenting herself as Tina Turner did. But it is a question, what is love? What does charity have to do with economics? And from the point of view of a Christian, that question is a very central one, because if you say that something is untouched by charity, or even worse, opposed to charity, then it doesn't have a place in the Christian life. So we've had a brief biblical passages we've looked at in all the lectures. Last time we looked at the rich young man, and that he was a good man, right? He's a good man, a righteous man. But it seemed that riches got in the way of him responding to the invitation that was given to him. And that was in the context of that the scriptures, especially the Gospels and the New Testament letters, have a very serious warning against the dangers, the spiritual dangers of material things. And of course, if you have more material things and there's a danger there, you have more dangers. So I propose we might start by looking at Matthew 22. So Matthew 22 is basically a series of disputes, right? So Jesus is with the crowd and people are challenging him on different topics. It's where we find the question put on taxes. Should you pay taxes? And then he gives the famous answer, render unto Caesar. So people are trying to trap him, right? He's becoming more prominent, attracting greater crowds. And some people are trying to trap him. And so they ask questions about taxes. There's the other question in that same chapter about the hypothetical situation of a woman who was married to 7 brothers, right? Each brother, she was a widow 7 times over. And, who will she be married to in heaven, right? The Sadducees brought that question. Jesus responds with another sort of clever answer, saying it's that you're getting the wrong end of it. There is no marriage or giving in marriage in heaven. And so as part of that, they asked him a question about the law. And they said, what is well, I'll read the question. When the Pharisees heard, this is verse 34, Matthew 22. When the Pharisees heard that he'd silenced the Sadducees on the marriage question, they came together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he, that's Jesus' response, said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So like the other responses, they ask a question that they think is going to sort of, hem Jesus in, and either response that he gives is going to be difficult. And the question of the law, as you know, there are many stipulations in the law, is very complex. And so if he picked one, then he'd be leaving something else out to give him grounds for to be caught out. And instead, he goes to the heart of the law and he says, the greatest commandment is to love God with all your mind, soul, strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else depends on those. And they are silenced, partly because they didn't outfox him, but partly because they're impressed that that's a very good answer to that question. So for our purpose, or for any purpose, actually, for that matter, if it's not related to love of God or love of neighbor, then it's not part of the Christian life. So it's a very serious question. What does love have to do with it? Where does charity fit in? So we can also take from that biblical basis, 1 John 4:8, the famous, he who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Right? So why is it so important? Good to see you. So if discipleship means greater conformity to the life of Christ, and God is love, then every aspect of our life has to, at least at the very minimum, not be opposed to the love of God and love of neighbor. But that would be the minimum standard. And obviously we want more than that. So when we think about economic life, we have to say, at the beginning, is it at least not opposed? And then, is there scope, or where does love fit? And if the answer to that is a negative answer, then this large part of life, we talked about that really in the first 2 lectures, how much of our life is taken up with economic affairs. I said several times that it's not the most important use of our freedom is economic freedom, the most important use of our energies, but the most common use, and that you can't go through a day without many economic transactions. Right? You can go through a day without exercising, for example, your right to vote. Most days actually are like that. You can go through a day without exercising your legal rights, right? If you're not been charged with something, or even your right to freedom of expression. You may not use it on a particular day. Maybe you're just camping somewhere. But economic life fills up most of our time. So all the more important then the question is, where does charity fit for the Christian? And there are basically three responses. There's more than three, but there's three basic responses to that question. The first is to say that economic life, economic activity, actively harms charity. So being immersed in this world is, it turns your heart away from God towards material things, and may even be worse than that, in that attachment to material things might actually lead you to do sinful things, right? So it's a negative assessment of economic activity. And every religious tradition has that strain to one degree or another in what Catholics would call religious life. It doesn't mean that they have that view particularly, but the way they organize their life is to get away as much as possible from material things, right? Or to be as least concerned. Now, obviously, they have to eat and they have a place to live and so forth, so you can't be completely opposed. But that idea that I leave the world behind because the world is corrupting exists in every religious tradition, right? Probably the most notable tradition would be the Buddhist tradition, because their actual disposition towards the material world is that attachment to material things turns you away from spiritual things. So the goal is to be as detached as possible, right? But that exists that view is there in all religious traditions, not usually held with the extreme, the severity of saying that all economic activity is corrupting, because you do have to eat and have to have some place to live. But we see that, and we actually, not only do we see it, but we admire it, right? We see people who live a very austere life, right? Who might do works of fasting, who might live very simply. Right? And you even see it in a non-religious, in a secular way, in that you find people who, for care of the environment or just for kind of health of soul, but in a more secular sense, try to limit their dependence on material goods. So it's a very common answer to say, well, this whole economic world is spiritually dangerous, so let's minimize our contact with it. So that's one answer to it. The other answer, more common answer, is that economic life is neutral. Right? So I do my work, and my work is my work, and then I have the rest of my life, and that's where I exercise charity. In my family life, in my life of faith, in my philanthropic life, in my religious life, my church life. But when I go to work, really, that's not where I exercise charity. So I don't think my work hinders that, but it's separate. They're sort of on parallel tracks. So I have my work life, and so to Brian's point, when he asked his students, where does charity fit? Where does love fit into economics? They were kind of nonplussed. That has nothing to do with it, right? It's just separate. And that's actually quite a common way of thinking. And people would say that I don't have a negative view of my work, but that's not where, to use Brian's invocation of Jonathan Sachs there, it's not where I find meaning. I need a job. I have a job. I may even like my job, but I'm not looking to my job to provide meaning for my life. I'm not looking to my job for a place where I'll exercise charity, or maybe even the other virtues, although we talked about that last time, the other virtues that do occur in economic life. So that's that idea of there's a kind of parallel track. And so economic life is largely neutral, and there's this parallel track where I exercise the virtues, especially virtues of charity. And the principal form for that would be the realm of the family. And the third answer to that question is that there's a kind of a hybrid dimension, right? Is that there are some philanthropic or even specifically charitable aspects to work, right? So maybe the enterprise I work in has a hybrid function. So we have our profit-making things, and then we give money to some good cause. Right? And that might just be what money is generated by the business. We allocate it to some good causes, or maybe we actually incorporate it in it. So, for example, one thought might be we do a certain number of free services. Right? So I run a hair salon, I have clients, I charge them what I charge them, but then, one afternoon a week I do free hairstyling for the indigent, right? Or think of a pro bono kind of work that an accounting firm or a law firm might take on, right? Or a private school might say we charge, this much in tuition, but then we give scholarships to certain people who couldn't afford to come here, right? So we're a profit-making business, but we're kind of a hybrid. So it's not that the charitable life is totally separate. It's not a parallel track. There's some intersection or points of contact, right? And in fact, in 2009, when Benedict XVI wrote his encyclical called Love in Truth, Caritas in Veritate, about social issues, he actually explored this idea of what he called hybrid enterprises. So they have a profit-making function and then a philanthropic or charitable function. But all of those three answers share one thing in common, is that the economic work itself is at least neutral, or let's say not charitable, right? So either it's corrupting, or it's neutral, or alongside you can incorporate some charity, but the economic activity itself is not a work of charity. So that one thing unites all those points, right? And that's probably how I think most people would think about the economic work. The actual work of the business, is that charitable? Say, no, that's business. And then maybe we do some good work, but that's not business, that's something different, right? So the idea is that the economic activities themselves do not make room for charity. So that's a problem, because we spend a lot of time on economic activities. And if you can only sort of jam charity in on the side, it would seem that we spend too much time, and we should actually, all of us should move towards the first category as much as possible, right? Because the first category, people try to minimize their economic activities so that they have a heart more open for charity. And if that's kind of unites all three versions, that economic activity itself is independent of charity, then really we should all be in that category, or we should be moving towards that category. So it's important to think about what another set of answers might be. So what is one of the problems about that? Or what is the root, or one of the roots, I'd better say, of this problem? Why is it that it seems that this large part of life doesn't have room for charity, when certainly the Christian tradition emphasizes that, and of course other traditions as well? So after all these centuries of lots of economic activity, why haven't we found some way to incorporate this essential virtue, and of course in the Christian ordering of things, the highest virtue? Well, one of the roots of that problem is that what is economics, or what is the heart of economics? We talked about this in our first lecture. Is what we observe in economics are exchanges. Actually, in our second lecture, I think, on liberty. Anyway, the point is that just like a biologist goes out to a field station and observes animals, and an astronomer observes the skies, in economics we observe exchanges. That's what we observe, right? Now, so we do it usually in aggregates, so we get a report on how many cars were sold in the country last year, or how many bushels of grain were sold, or whatever. But that's an aggregate of a lot of individual exchanges. That's what we observe, are exchanges. And what governs exchanges, if you say what virtue governs exchanges, the virtue that governs exchanges is the virtue of justice, right? Which is a philosophical virtue, right? So I'll just make a small parenthesis. We think of philosophical virtues, or sometimes called natural virtues, or in the Catholic tradition, cardinal virtues. And those are virtues that are they're very important virtues, but they don't have reference to God, right? And there's 4 of them. Now I'm going to make sure I don't embarrass myself and forget, but wisdom, fortitude, temperance, and justice, right? No, prudence is in there. So I got 5. That's not very good. That's how good I am. I add extra cardinal virtues. Temperance, courage, temperance, fortitude, wisdom, and prudence. Okay, there we are. Those are the cardinal virtues. But anyway, so justice is not one of them, but justice is a natural virtue. And then we have what are called theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, which have reference to God. That's why they're called theological, right? So there's a separation. So justice is one of the most important of the natural. You don't have to be Christian, that is, or Muslim or Jewish to believe in justice, right? So justice is what governs exchanges, right? So we make an exchange, and it's just if you give me what you say you were going to give me, and I give you what I say I'm going to give you in return. That's one way of saying it's a just exchange. Or I pay you something for whatever you're selling to me, and a third party can make an observation. That was a fair exchange. That was a just, whatever criteria he wants to use, that was just, right? So if you sell me, I don't know, a diamond necklace, and you think the diamonds are fake, but I know they're real and I pay you very little, someone would say, well, that was not a just exchange. And the cause of that was a lack of information. We didn't know what was going on. Or it could be power, right? So if I took your necklace because I had a gun, then it is an exchange, but it's an exchange rooted in fear, right? It's not a voluntary exchange. So, but justice is the key virtue, right? But justice is not charity. Justice is not love. Justice is not bad. In fact, quite to the contrary, it's very good. But if the dominant reality of economic analysis are exchanges, and the virtue that governs exchanges is justice, then it's not just a kind of incidental or accidental problem that charity is not there. It's because charity is not what governs exchanges. If you have an exchange, what you're concerned about is justice, not about love. So the discipline, the way we look at the world, is not with charity in mind, right? Which is not a criticism. A biologist doesn't really look at the world with charity in mind either. Or if you went to the courts of law, right? And if you objected to the judge and say, where is charity in your deliberations? You'd say, well, that's not what we do here. We do justice. Right? If he's a more sophisticated thinker, he may say, well, you can't have real concern for the common good, or you can't have real concern for your fellow citizens if you don't have concern for justice, right? But that's not the place, right? In fact, if you go before the court and you beg for mercy, you're kind of saying, let me go outside the normal regime. I know what I'm entitled to in justice, but hear me out. I want something different from you, right? So it's not a uniquely economic problem that justice is the governing virtue. But where then is love going to be included in a world of exchange? So just as another parenthesis for those who read Catholic social teaching. So one of the reasons that, for example, John Paul was quite good on economic affairs in his analysis of them is because unusually amongst popes, he was a philosopher. Right? So his predecessors had largely been trained in, a canon law. They were legal scholars, or John the 23rd was a historian. But John Paul was an academic philosopher. He was a professional philosopher. And philosophers tend to be good at economics, or at least they have the capacity to be good at economics, because that's where economics came from, right? From moral philosophy. And if you look at the world as a philosopher, then looking at exchanges and where they fit and justice is actually very congenial. Right? Now, his successor, Benedict XVI, was not a philosopher. He's a theologian, right? Which is also very unusual. Usually, to have an academic theologian as pope, most of them are historically trained in other disciplines. And so it was of interest to Benedict, where does charity fit? That's the theological virtue. A philosopher might be quite content to say, well, I can see that justice is achieved here. Because that's really sort of operating at the, let me say, the highest ambition of philosophy would be a just society. You could say that. Right? But from a Christian point of view, a theological point of view, you want to say, well, where does charity fit? Right? And that's why, if you read his major document on social affairs that included economics, there's a kind of dissatisfaction both in the writer and in the reader, because it's not clear where charity fits, although Benedict is clear to say it must fit somewhere, has to fit somewhere, right? You can't say that this part of life is outside the realm of charity. So where are we going to stick, fit, cajole, jam love into this world of exchange governed by this world of economics, which is governed by exchanges? So the solution I'm going to propose to you is one that I learned from a man named John Mueller. We used to teach together in the summers in Krakow in a seminar that was inspired by John Paul. And but John's still alive, but he's not able to travel anymore due to illness. So one of the lectures that I give over there is basically his book. And his book is called Redeeming Economics. It's 10 years old, 2014, Redeeming Economics, Rediscovering the Missing Element. And I think his solution to this problem is a very good one. He's a very interesting fellow. I mean, he's just a bit about his background. He was involved in the 1980s in politics. And he is the kind of person he most was, I think he worked for him and was associated with Jack Kemp. So Jack Kemp is no longer, I don't think Jack Kemp is still alive, I don't think. But anyway, you don't hear his name a lot, but he was very prominent. He was a congressman from Buffalo. But before that, he was the quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, I believe. And he was a very market-oriented congressman, but what distinguished him, he had a tremendous passion for the poor. And he thought that the best way to liberate and uplift the poor in material circumstances and also in a holistic way was through markets. So he was a market advocate, but market advocate for reasons that didn't motivate a lot of other market advocates. And he ended up, I think, as if I remember correctly, he was the vice presidential candidate along with Bob Dole in 1996. Anyway, John Mueller used to work for him. Then he went into the world of finance. And so he had the political background. Jack Kemp was a very intellectual figure. And then he worked in the world of finance for a long time, John Mueller. And in 2014, he wrote this book called Redeeming Economics, which is a very theoretical book. So I'm not sure I'd recommend it to a general audience, because you might find a lot of what he's concerned about not to be evident why he's concerned about it. But what he presents is, he's saying we're rediscovering the missing element. So here's the summary. So he says there are three big stages in the history of economics in this sense, in what is considered to be economic activity. So he's not concerned really with the models. I mean, he's concerned a bit about that, but what he's trying to get his hands around is, when people think about economics, what are they thinking about? What activities are they thinking about? Not so much how do they model them or how do they measure them, but what do they consider to be an economic activity? And he presents the high point of this in he's called it scholastic economics. So scholastic period is the 13th century, basically. And at the time, there are different schools of philosophy. So it's called the scholastic period. And he says that was where economics, in his view, had the broadest vision, and he calls it AAA economics. And there are three A's. First A is for Aristotle, second A is for Augustine, third A is for Aquinas. Right? And he said, what was the view? So Aristotle starts off with an observation of how households operate. right? So he has this idea of, what kinds of activities are in a household. In Mueller's reading, what Augustine adds to that is he says the social order is determined by your loves, right? That's one of the key insights of Augustine. Augustine, for example, in a different context, more political context, when he talks about the city of man and the city of God, he's talking about those things that, are ordered to love of man or love of God, right? It's not that man is opposed to God, but to where the order of loves. And Mueller's reading is that in the scholastic period, Thomas Aquinas put these things together, which Thomas is very famous of doing, synthesizing things. And so you have a vision of the economy, scholastic period, AAA economics, John Mueller's term. And he says it looks at the economy, and when it looks at what's considered economic activity, it has 4 parts to it, or 4 aspects to it, right? The 4 are production, exchange, consumption, and distribution. So it's not so much how do you measure or model it, but what do you consider to be economic activity? Production, exchange, consumption, and distribution are the categories that mark AAA economics, scholastic economics. Okay. I'm going to go ahead, then I'm going to come back. Mueller says that when Adam Smith started, 18th century, to write about the economy, in order to model what was going on, and when you're constructing a model, the fewer aspects, the more simple it is, the better the model is to use. It's easier to use. And he said classical economics, which we associate with Adam Smith, really only had 2 aspects, production and exchange. So he talked about how production, division of labor, all of those things, and exchange, right? So I'm going to exchange, so I've got to think about my customers and what would serve their needs. Right? We talked about that in the previous lectures. Leaving out the other 2 categories, consumption and distribution. 100 years after, so we're now talking towards the end of the 19th century, as economics became more and more its own discipline, it was observed that actually consumption was a big part of the economy. Big part of the economy. And so the neoclassical model includes production, exchange, and consumption, right? As these are economic activities, right? Why does that matter? It matters a great deal because what you consider an economic activity is going to influence very much what you think you can do about the economy. So if your model, in a classical model, you want to stimulate economic growth, what might you do? Well, if your categories are production and exchange, you might somehow try and generate, maybe subsidize or make somehow easier capital investment or accumulation, or exchange, trade, right? Those are the things you would do, right? Today, when governments want to stimulate the economy, what's the typical thing they might think to do? What's the most common thing that they do? Spend. And what would they spend on?
Services, investments in infrastructure, or supports.
They probably, yes, they may do that, but it's not the most common thing that they do. What's the most common thing that the government does today if they want to stimulate the economy quickly? Reduce taxes or direct transfers to people. Why? Or reduce interest rates to stimulate consumption, because that's the quickest thing, right? If you want to invest in infrastructure, it might take a while to build a bridge, but you can buy something online right this very minute, right? Even before you have the money. Well, that would not have been a solution. In 1825, people would not have thought about that because they didn't consider consumption. Right? In the classical model, I'm not saying they didn't know about consumption. I'm just saying, what did they consider, right? So today, consumption is a very big part of what we think about as the economy, and we often try to influence it, right? So it matters what's in your model, okay? So now I'm going to go back because you may wonder, okay, what is this? What does this all have to do with love? But we're going to get there eventually. So John Mueller has this great example. It's my all-time favorite example. I use it all the time in classes. It's the dinner party example, right? So you're having a dinner party. Who's here has hosted a dinner party? I know you have. I've been to your dinner parties, actually. So So what do you do when you're doing, when you, tell me, take me through your, how you organize a dinner party. What do you do? What's what you call someone else? All right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So how do you organize the evening? What are things you do before you have your dinner party?
Set up your invitations. See
Okay.
who's coming, how many people you have.
Okay. And then what do you do? So you've got invitations, you figure out who's coming. What else do you do?
Then I start planning.
Reason why.
Well, yeah, reason.
Reason why? Okay. Why you're having the dinner party in the first place. And then you've invited people. And then what else do you do? So you buy food. Okay. So you buy food. And what else then you do after that?
Eat it.
You eat the food. Okay. What do you do between buying the food and eating the food?
Provide entertainment.
What's that? Provide entertainment. Oh, wow.
Cook it.
Paul, this is not your part of the. It's not a show. It's a dinner party. What's that? Cook it. Okay. There we are. Okay. So does that sound like our 4 categories? What are our 4 categories? Anybody paying attention? What's that? Speak up. Be bold. Oh, he's reading it off his phone. Oh, you're right. You're taking notes. He's recording it. It goes. It's going straight to the Chinese embassy, which is just around the corner there. Yeah. So these 4 categories, this is John Miller's example. It's a good example. So you have production. That's your cooking. That's the work you do, right? There's exchange, the things that you buy because you don't have them and you need them. So you go to the shop and you buy the things. There's the consumption, right? The actual eating of the food. And there's distribution. Who's invited? Like who's going to be in the group, right? So those are the 4 parts of the economy. It makes it easier to understand. Okay. So of those 4, what's the most important? Production. Production, consumption. We've got 2. Okay, do you want to make your case in 3 sentences or less?
Well, if you don't have any food, there's no consumption and there's no, I guess exchange would be that you need to get food as inputs for production.
So there's no production, there's no consumption. Okay, so that's his world, production and consumption. Okay, fine, good. You said consumption. What, there's nothing left? What do you mean there's nothing left? So that's the most important thing. So if you didn't have consumption, okay. All right. Okay, good. Anybody else want to, oh, you in the back? What do you have? Monica? Without the guest, there is no party. Okay, so we've had 3 people. You agree?
I think the most important thing would be the guest.
Most important thing is the guests. Okay, we've got 2 for guests. Interesting, the 2 women who are actually thinking who might be there instead of the food to be eaten. Yes? Exchange. It's the only one that has 2 parties involved, the exchange.
Correct. You can do everything else on your own. You invite people on your own, food, your own, without another economic party involved.
Well, so exchange requires something. Okay, that's interesting. I never thought about that. So he's saying because it requires somebody else, other things can be done on their own. I don't think invitations can be done on your own. You have to invite somebody. I mean, you're right. You invite them, but I mean, it's by its nature, it's a relational thing. So the correct answer is distribution, right? Because who's coming, right? Because if you don't have anybody coming, then you probably don't have a dinner party. But you could imagine, let's imagine that you invite people, they come, but somehow there's a big power outage. And so you can't eat. Is the dinner party, has it lost all of its essence? Right? So you can actually have a dinner party. It's less about dinner than the party, but right, there's something there. So you can imagine a dinner party without, let's say you broke your leg, so you couldn't do any cooking, but your guests were still there, right? The supermarket was closed, right? You could imagine that all 4 are parts. They're all integrated, but John Mueller's point is that actually distribution is the reason the whole thing gets started in the first place. Okay. So this is what is the distribution aspect, right? We know what production, consumption, and exchange is, but this distribution, what is it, right? Well, so let me ask another question. Dinner parties. What do you usually charge your guests when they come for a dinner party? Really? You don't charge anything? I've paid Ray every time I've been over there. He didn't tell you. Oh my goodness. Every time. It's not cheap either. Luke couldn't get in with his $10 bill, I can assure you that. So you don't charge, but Ray charges. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to create domestic trouble there. Okay, wow. That's probably why he didn't come tonight. He might be exposed. He's still working. That's what you think. You don't, okay. But you don't know. You don't even know he charges his guests. Anyway, so if you go to the Pennings for dinner, you pay. But you don't charge. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so why don't you charge?
Because it's charity. You want them to come.
Right, so it's a kind of charity. It's at least goodwill. It could be more motivated by more than that. So if you're not charging, so if you were, I mean, you could imagine a dinner party, by the way, where people charge, right? A dinner group, they get together, they divide up the costs or whatever. You could imagine that. But then it's a kind of exchange, or it's a kind of joint production, right? What's left out if you're charging, or rather, if you don't charge, what's included? Charity, right? The term she used, probably because of the topic of the lecture. But really what it is it's a gift, right? It's a gift. So you're giving a gift. And for economic purposes, when I say gift, all I mean is that there's a transfer that's not an exchange. I don't mean anything more than that, right? So I'm not saying that you feel obliged. So you might feel obliged to host family Thanksgiving, and you might say it's actually a sense of duty, but for our purposes, it's a gift. If there's a transfer without an exchange, that's a gift, right? So the most important aspect of this activity, which has production and exchange and consumption involved, is actually gift giving, right? And what virtue governs gifts? Charity, right? The virtue that governs exchanges is justice. The virtue that governs gifts is love, right? So that's the solution that John Mueller offers. I find it very persuasive, because he says the gift-giving element, you can't explain the dinner party without the gift-giving element. It may not even take place. And John Mueller's argument is that a very large part of economic activity is motivated by gift-giving. Would you agree? You're nodding your head. Why would you agree? I'm talking to you right there. I don't know your name, so I kept the point, sorry. Yeah.
Why would I? Because, well,
It's the right answer. Just why do you think that a lot of economic activity is governed by gift giving? I said, why do you think a lot of economic activity is driven by gift giving?
I think we should give. I'm sorry. I think that at the end of the day, I think that we're more than just transactional. think that we have much more dimensions to that, and so I think that's why it's correct. That's why Brian is saying that's what cars are not, because at the end of the day, we're much more than that. So our economics would also be more.
Because that's a very good insight. What's your name, by the way?
Angelica.
Angelica. Thank you, Angelica. So that's a good insight, is that, okay, so Angelica started off with an observation about the human heart, said we're not just transactional creatures, so we're meant to give more, and therefore our economics should reflect that, right? But you could argue it the opposite way, which is where I was starting, but that's a perfectly fine way to argue it, is to say that, okay, our economic activity should correspond to that we're not just exchanging creatures, we're actually gift-giving creatures, right? So that's a good argument of why it should be the case that our economic activity is driven largely by gift-giving. But is it in fact the case? Who else agrees with that statement? That our economic activity is driven largely by gift-giving? Okay, who disagrees with that?
I'll agree with it, but I'll add something to that. I think if you want a long-term successful customer,
Mm-hmm.
if that customer perceives to have better value,
Right.
you give them a burger for $5, like $7, I'm going to go back and buy or whatever.
Now, is that love?
Well, it's not love.
It's not love, okay.
It's selfishness, but of course.
Well, it's not self. Remember we talked last time about self-interest and selfishness are not the same thing? So it's not selfishness, but it's not love. So you don't think that economic activity is driven by love, by gift giving?
Well, in that sense, not. But I think if I want a successful business, I want my customer to think.
Okay, so that's now you're actually getting further afield because you're actually arguing that what you are doing and what your customer thinks, there should be a divergence between the two. And we're not trying to go down that road. Well, you may be trying to go down that road, but I'm not saying we don't want to go down that road, Christian. So, okay, so obviously some of you think that it's not driven. Why don't you think it's not driven?
Oh, no, I think it is.
Okay.
A lot of most parents, for example, a lot of the economic activity that they do is to give their children a better future.
Mhm.
That's by love for their children.
Right. Pardon me? Did you say?
A lot of the economic activity of parents, for example, is by love for their
Driven by love for their children. I thought you said trying to buy love for their children. Which is actually probably not far off in a way, but anyway. So this is what I remember. I went back to the point I said that for the purpose of our discussion, a gift is something that's a transfer without an exchange, right? So now the reason you had trouble answering that question is that most people do not consider parents looking after their children or their elderly parents or their relatives or others as gifts, right? Because people think of it as their duty. So, but which is fine. I'm not arguing against that. But strictly speaking, if there's a transfer that's not an exchange, it's a gift, right? So if you ask people, why do you work, right? They'll give several answers to that question. But one of the most common answers is, I work to provide for someone else, right? It's probably the most common answer, actually, right? I provide for myself, but I provide for someone else, right? How many times might you hear someone say, oh, I would like to retire, but, I've still got, children in university, so I still have to work. Or I'd like to retire, or I'd like to work less, but, I have a brother who's very sick and the treatment is very expensive, so I'm working a second job, right? So it's actually where love comes into it is in the motivation, right? So we leave that out. We leave that out. We leave those motivations out. And Mueller is arguing that we can look back and say, okay, adding consumption into the model makes the neoclassical model better than the classical model. But we haven't actually recovered this missing element, which is the fourth element, which is distribution, right? So gifts are governed by love. And if there's a lot of gift giving going on, it means there's a lot of love in that narrower construction of love in the economy. So where does love fit into it? Love fits into it not as a specific aspect of activity like consumption, production, exchange, but it's the motivation that makes all the rest possible. So it's a very so Mueller's presentation, which I'm giving to you, he reads that into what the scholastic view of economics would be. Right? Yes? If the four components were bricks, or three were bricks, would love be the mortar that holds them together? Well, that's a kind of interesting view of love, some sort of kind of cement-like substance that hardens and can become brittle over time. Maintenance. Yes, I don't think I would say I prefer to say motivation, because it's not that there's three things exist and then they need to be united, because you don't have to. You can have you can have production, consumption, and exchange without love, without gift giving. We have a lot of it, actually. But where does love fit into it, right? So the person who is working and says, I don't see love in my workplace, like I don't see that that's there, it's probably where love fits into his life, where his economic life fits into his life of discipleship, is the motivation, which might be for his family or it might be for others. He might work to do something else. So this idea that gifts motivate economic activity, particularly labor, right? So we work in order to provide for ourselves, but often to provide for others. Right? So that's where love fits. The mistake that people make, or the mistake that John Mueller is trying to help us correct, is that we want to say love is there, so we try and make love part of consumption or part of exchange or part of production. And when we find unsatisfactory answers, it's because it doesn't really belong there. Right? Love is not an exchange, right? When I was a chaplain at Queens, the students used to like to have, they used to want to have a Christmas gift exchange, right? So first of all, I said, it's not Christmas, so you can't call it Christmas gift exchange because it's in December. So I'd say they have to call it an Advent. And I said, well, is it a gift or is it an exchange? I said, it's either one or the other, it's not both. And then they would find it tedious, but I didn't. And I would say, tell me the difference. And so everybody knows the difference, right? So if, as a professor, I don't know, one of my students' parents comes by and says, oh, by the way, I understand your interest in the symphony. I've got tickets here, go to the symphony. I say, what a kind gift. If 2 weeks later he calls me up and says, by the way, you enjoy the symphony? I said, I did. Well, my son's having trouble in your class. Maybe you could go easy on the exams. And I say, oh, my mistake. I thought it was a gift. It's an exchange, which is fine. It's a different kind of thing. It's not actually fine, but because those exchanges are prohibited, but it's a different kind of thing. And you can, right? And you can get confused if you think one is the other. But we know the difference between it, right? So gift giving really helps us to understand where love can fit into economics, right? So let me give you 3 examples. I know I'm getting a bit long here, and there's another section I want to get to. So 3 big issues in the country at the moment: childcare, healthcare, and housing. Can't understand them without gift giving, right? So if you have a childcare program in the country, we have, by the way, anybody puts up her hand wants a almost infinite array of documents on childcare. You're in the right place. We've got them here at Cardus. Anything you want to know about what the government does or doesn't do. So childcare in the country, about 40% of families roughly use paid childcare. Right? And of the other 60%, they're divided roughly in half amongst parents who look after their own children at home, and that's one half, 30%. The other 30% roughly use some other form of childcare, usually relatives or friends, right? So that's basically the mix, right? So if you only have an exchange model or a production model or a consumption model, only the first category fits into that, right? If you're looking after your own children, That's a kind of a gift you're giving in the family. You might say, well, that's childcare provision at home, so it's a kind of production. You might be able to get at it somehow. It's very hard to get at the grandparents looking after the children that way, right? So you don't understand childcare in the country if you only have an exchange or production or consumption model. You have to have a gift model. You have to include that, right? Healthcare, right? Healthcare, well, first of all, one of the largest fundraising operations in the country is for healthcare, hospitals and other things. So there's a big philanthropic dimension. So that's obviously one part of our healthcare system is driven by philanthropy. It's not an insignificant amount. But also, there's all kinds of healthcare which we presume is going to be provided by someone in your family, right? So you go home and you're told, well, you know, have someone take you home, have someone help you with this, right? It's very common, right? In fact, if you don't have someone, the system kind of breaks down, right? If you live by yourself, as I do, and you've been sedated and you have to get home somehow, you realize how important gift giving is. You have to find someone. Well, I could hire someone, but you know, usually you ask a friend, right, to drive you home or somebody, right? So healthcare, think of especially elderly people, right? Most of the care of our elderly people of a healthcare nature before they go to long-term care homes is gift. And when they're there, often it's gift. Who goes to visit? Who checks up on them and so forth, right? Housing. Right? Can't understand the housing market in Canada if you don't understand gift giving, right? Where do most down payments come for most couples, right? Is gifts from their parents, right? The number one thing that would reduce house prices in Canada within days by a very significant percentage was if all the parents in Canada got together and agreed not to give their children money for down payments. It would be the best thing for the housing market in the country, right? Wouldn't require any complicated investments, wouldn't require a lot of things. It would just cut the demand. You'd have probably a very significant decrease. Now that's another favorite thing of it. That's a collective active problem, which is not collective action problem, which is not our topic tonight. So you can't, right? You can't get everybody to agree. But boy, if they could, wouldn't that be great, right? Our housing market is driven on, in part, I'm not sure what percentage of houses are first-time homeowners, but I remember sitting on a plane once with a mortgage broker. Not with a mortgage broker. I was on a plane and I was seated beside a mortgage broker. I don't fly with mortgage brokers at all times. Have someone at the ready in case of a deal. And we got talking and I said, this is over 10 years ago, maybe longer. And I said, so mortgage brokers, if you can't qualify for a mortgage at one of the big banks, you end up with a mortgage broker. And I said, what percentage of your clients get their down payments from a gift from their parents, or that'd be the normal place? And he didn't understand the question. And I asked again, he said, what do you mean, what percentage? I said, how many? And he said, well, all of them. What do you say? He said, all of them. There are none. There's no one who gets a down payment in the secondary mortgage market, right? In the primary one, different. But in the market that mortgage brokers serve, he said, there's no one who doesn't. There's no one. Everybody gets it from someone else, right? So you can't understand the market, housing market, right? If you don't understand gift giving, which is why some of our policies in housing don't work as well as we think they do, because we think we make things more affordable, but actually what we're doing is we're just increasing the gifts that the parents give their children to get into the market. So it would be very unpopular. Well, it might be popular with some, but if you could ban it, if you could ban parents giving money, or if you could ban banks or mortgage issuers from considering the gift portion of a down payment in calculating the mortgage, you would do wonders for the housing market. In terms of affordability, there'd be other problems that would be caused. But so you can't understand it. Those are three big issues you can't understand if there's less gift giving. Okay. All right, so that's an argument largely where charity can find a place, this missing element. So what I want to finish with here, and I understand I'm going a bit long, but we got delayed with Luke talking about trying to deceive his customers. Make them feel loved. That really is about the worst thing you've said, actually, isn't it? to make someone feel loved who is not loved. That's about as low as it gets. There we are. So where I want to finish, though, is to point out that this exchange, justice, gift, love tension is really, I've proposed some ways to deal with it, but it really is perpetual or enduring because the disciplines, if you want to say philosophy and exchanges and justice and theology and love and gift are, you can find areas of compatibility, but there is a fundamental difference. So we can start off with saying, what is love, right? So what is love? What is the classic definition of love? I'm sure we have people here who would tell me what it, what's self-giving. Is that the classic definition of love? Maybe your definition of love, but okay. We're going to hold on to that because I think it's important. But the classic philosophical definition of love is what? Do you know? Yes?
Will the good of the other.
To will the good of the other. Sounds so romantic, right? I will the good of the other. Doesn't sound very nice in English. But by the way, now when I was studying, I had to learn Italian, and that's actually how Italians say I love you. Right? I will your good. But it's not will, but ti voglio bene. I desire what's good for you. Right? That's how they actually say I love you, like romantically say I love you, which is interesting, probably because their culture goes back, back to the classical period. So to will the good of the other is what we should, and I would add to that, for the other's sake, right? Which means that you have to be concerned, you can't be indifferent. So I will the good of the other for the other's sake. And then I'd add what Paul mentioned here is that I'm willing to give of myself for that. Right? I think better to say I would sacrifice, right? So to love somebody is I desire the good of the other for the other's sake, and I'm willing to sacrifice something of my good for that other. That's, I think, a definition of love, right? So if you're at the stage of life where you're wondering, does someone love me? That might be a question on your mind, right? You say, well, how do I know if he loves me? How do I know if she loves me? Right? Well, does she enjoy spending time with me? I mean, that could be, but is that love? But you say, I know this person loves me because I observe him sacrificing for me. That's when you know, right? And most of us learn that from our parents. So a child just presumes that the parents exist to provide services for the child. Right? That's how children think about them. And then we hope at some point, as they mature, that they understand, oh, my parents are making sacrifices for me. Right? And then they learn, why would my parents do that? Why are my parents doing so many things that when I look at it, I understand is not for their own good? It doesn't bring them, driving me somewhere, or, all the work that goes in outside the home, inside the home. And we hope the child then understands, well, that's love, and I understand that I'm being loved because of that. Right? So that's what love is, right? If we use that definition, I think it's a defensible definition, that to will the good of the other for the other's sake and to sacrifice for it. So what then is the opposite of love? If that's what love is, I want to know what love is. That journey, I want to know what love is. Somebody tell me. So what's the opposite? Selfishness. Maybe. What else might be the opposite of love? What's that? To choose not to sacrifice. That might be selfish, that I'm not willing to sacrifice. So I desire your good, and I desire it for your sake, but I'm not willing to sacrifice, right? So that's not love. I would say that you haven't achieved love, but I wouldn't say it's the opposite of love. What would be the opposite of love? Yes? Indifference. So actually, indifference fails at the first stage. I don't care, right? Okay, that's a good answer. Must have got a good education, right? Right? What another answer might you give? What would be the opposite of love? Tricia suggested to use another. What might be another answer to that question?
Hate.
Pardon me?
Hate.
Hate, okay. So what would hate look like? So the hate would be, yeah, go ahead.
Making a sacrifice for someone.
Right, right. So hate is to say that I desire some ill for another, and I'm willing to sacrifice to achieve that, right? Now, you can't say I desire the ill for the other person's sake, because that's a contradiction, right? Obviously, it's not good for the person, but I desire something bad to happen to the other, and I'm willing to sacrifice for it. So hate is it's a real thing. It exists, but it's relatively rare because it involves a sacrifice to make someone else's life worse. So you may actually desire something bad to happen to somebody, but you may not be willing to sacrifice for it, especially if it's a significant sacrifice, right? So hate it's a reality, it certainly exists, but it's not that common because you have to sacrifice my good, right? But what is very common is this other category of using, right? Which is to say that I desire my good for my sake, and I'm willing to sacrifice the other for my sake. That's to use somebody, right? And we know the difference, right? Because like in the example I gave, I could say, oh, I thought my students' parents were giving me a gift. So they had my good. I like the symphony. They were looking after me, but they're actually using me to achieve some good for their son or their family, right? Or in romantic love, that can be very painful, right? Very common thing, you hear that, oh, I thought that she loved me, but she was just using me, right? Right. He's nodding vigorously over there. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to bring up painful memories. I hope memories, my goodness. Might be the present moment. So this is the difficulty because one of our fundamental concepts in economics is utility. Right? It's very central to our whole way of thinking, and utility sounds a lot like usefulness because it's the same word, right? What's useful? What gives you utility? The same word. So in economics, we tend to think that people are motivated by, they try to maximize their utility. We say that all the time. And it has a lot of resonance because in many cases that's what you're trying to do in your commercial relationships. So not only does it have a place, it's actually an accurate description that has a lot of powerful analytic, explanatory, and even predictive power. So it's a very central concept for us in economics. But it's not love, right? And it's possible that you can have useful relationships, right? That goes right back to Aristotle, friendships of utility, right? One of his categories. So you can have friendships of utility or relationships of utility which don't militate against charity. You can have both. But you can see that the whole concept or the framework of utility maximizing to use can lead you to something that's quite the opposite of love, right? To sacrifice the other. Now, it's not necessarily the case because the premise of our utility maximizing framework is that both parties are getting a mutual benefit so that it doesn't require a sacrifice of the other. So you can defend it by saying the mutually voluntary exchange is not sacrificing the good of the other. So I'm not actually using that person. It's not by necessity that this is the case, but you can see that there's that danger. That's why religious traditions warn so much against the spiritual dangers. Not because it's always the case, but because it's very easily the case that I can turn someone from an object of love into an object of use, right? And we cannot do without the concept of utility in economics. And if that is at odds with the dynamic of gift giving and love, there's this tension that's always going to be there, right? Which is why our religious traditions are wise to warn us. Wise to warn us against those spiritual dangers. Okay. I think I'm going to stop there. So, very good. Oh.
Gift giving and volunteerism in the economic sector, very important. There's a lot of volunteers doing all kinds of stuff throughout the economic system.
Yeah, I would say that, I talked about philanthropy and what I meant by that was largely uh, giving of your resources, but obviously giving of your time would be so that the philanthropic sector, which is a big part. Yeah.
Okay, so Father Raymond, I want to ask you, I got two questions for you. The first one is, do you think you went deep enough when you were talking about a gift, when you talked about gift as being distribution?
Hmm.
Because I wonder, and this is something that I often say to my kids, that you cannot choose your last name or your nose. And that's just a short form for, first of all, pointing out the dikema nose on which you can build dynasties. But the second one is to note that in terms of production itself, which let's assume distribution, but even in terms of production, the thing which you are using, let's just say it's raw material, stone, let's say we're quite ancient, stone, grass, is itself something that you did not produce and is something that is simply there. It's a gift, so to speak. And so I wonder if you can maybe talk to us a little bit about that in some sense, at least I think perhaps for all of us, even a secular audience, that even the raw material of our economic activity, including our own brains and our own selves, are things that we did not produce or exchange for. Could you maybe reflect on that?
Yeah, that's a different aspect of the gift. So basically, the point of view that I was looking at things from was the point of view of the actor who's engaging in the economy, and I'm producing, I'm exchanging, I'm consuming, and I'm giving, right? So that's where I can fit gift giving and therefore love into my economic activity. But there's another aspect which I didn't address, so I'm glad you brought it up, which you could say that I can only exist as the consequence of gifts. So your children, independent of you and your wife, they don't have an existence. And you can argue also, well, the materials of the earth, right? So there's a very strong Christian tradition that says that you contribute some of your labor, and that you may say is yours. But if you're farming a field and it's a fertile field, you can't take credit for that, right? Now we tend to be in a more individualistic culture. So a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, I'm not sure if he was a candidate or running for re-election, but President Obama made a comment about successful entrepreneurs and says, you didn't build that on your own. If you used roads, if you used people who went to university, you didn't, and then it became big. And a more individualistic response said, yeah, I did it myself. And it became a big controversy. But he had a point in that, to a certain degree, you can say we have the common good as a claim on us, because even the most rugged individual has already received many kinds of gifts. That's actually a very powerful argument for collective action, whether private or state, to say that you actually owe injustice, right? Now, if you pursue that far enough, you can actually make some progress to getting away from relying on gifts, because you say injustice, like if you went to a very fine university, the benefits to that means that injustice you should, sort of give back. But I would say that the whole point of view of the talk was from someone who's acting, and where does gift giving fit into that? But a Christian response to that would be that the primary reality of being a creature is that you're receiving, right? So you receive your existence, you receive the goods of the natural world, you receive the cooperation of others. And so in Christian and Catholic social teaching, when we talk in this way that I've been talking, there is a strain that's very critical of that, because they say you're speaking as if you are first an agent or an actor and not a receiver. You're speaking as if your creativity makes you a creator and not a creature, and they warn against that. And it's a very coherent point of view. I don't share it, but it's a very coherent objection.
Why don't you share it?
Well, because I think that we're not making a claim that, I mean, I think, let's put it this way, a father of a son who claims authority over a son is not claiming that he is the God of his son, but there is a legitimate agency of the father in begetting the son. I think likewise in the creative that our economic activity is legitimately creative. I just think that receptivity, the idea of a purely receptive existence is more of a spiritual category than a material one. So I don't think it works very well for economics. I think it's very hard to be an entrepreneur if you don't think that your creativity is somehow what you have to offer. But it's a coherent theological attack. For those who are interested, the principal person who just recently died a few years ago was David Schindler at Catholic University, who argued against people who are my mentors on that line of thinking. But I think it's more of a spiritual critique than an actual economic critique. It's a bit like saying in politics that the fundamental reality of politics should not be that you're in a kind of liberal individualism, but that you should be politically as recipients of your dignity from God, and the state should somehow mediate that, which is coherent in one way, but you say, what happens if the state isn't good at mediating that? And so you want to have a democracy with a limited state. That would be an analogy.
Right. And I'll move on, but I just want to think that I actually do think that the spiritual or theological point actually has a real world economic consequences. So my theological background, I'm a Reformed Christian or a Calvinist, and everyone talks about the Calvinist work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And our theological assumptions would say that we are created in God's image, and that all of what we have is given to us as a gift, and that in order to respond, and not only that, but there is and this is very theological. For those of you who aren't Christian, this is inside baseball, but I think it has implications for society, which is that, okay, we have misused those gifts. We have attempted to become like God ourselves and so on. We failed to do so. And Jesus gave us the gift of himself in order to fulfill justice, as my friend Andrea pointed out tonight when we were talking about there's no such thing as a free lunch, even in salvation.
You were talking during my talk?
No. Before your talk. I would never dream of talking during your talk. But the point I'm trying to make...
Most discouraging to hear that.
The point I'm trying to make is that Reformed people would say that, look, in response to the gift that we've been given, we work out of gratitude, and that's why we work so darn hard. And that, as history has shown, if you look at the economy of the Netherlands and other places, even today, places with those Protestant backgrounds tend to have better work ethics, better economies, and so on. So there's, anyway, I just wanted to drop that in there to note that. Anyways, we'll talk more about that. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Any questions out there? Anything burning? Yes, Dan.
Thank you very much for the talk tonight. One thing I've been seeing more and more in articles, Tyler Cowen, for example. I also know Arnold Kling.
Pardon me, who you say?
Tyler Cowen. He's a economist in the United States.
Revolution.
Yes, Arnold Kling also writes a Substack, and he's an economist. There's been a lot of criticisms about the not-for-profit sector. Now, you spoke a lot about home and households and how they are set up primarily as, parents sacrificing themselves for their family members for their well-being. What do you think is the role of in not-for-profits in the model that you've talked about today?
Well, a charitable institution. So first of all, I would distinguish between institutions which have their fundamental identity, let's say a religious institution, that they carry on economic activities, corporate works of mercy, and so forth, but actually their organizing principle is not, scientific research for disease. It's religious, and then they do other works. And then you have the nonprofit sector, which is oriented towards a particular goal, summer camps for children, cancer research, or whatever. So that, I think, is a legitimate expression of provision of services without exchanges. So it's a charitable act. It's a gift-giving act. So I'm that would be part of that. And Paul's point about just volunteerism or philanthropy. So that would be, we looked at the household, but that would be an extension of the gift-giving reality. The criticism comes in that a nonprofit can, or even a church for that matter, can actually lose its motivation for gift giving and could become institution building, right? So you could have, it's very easy to see that. And there's a whole theory of economics called public choice about how non-profit making institutions can still be pursuing their interests. So you could observe a charity or a nonprofit sector that is actually not about gift giving and so forth, right? So that's, and to try and guard against that, we have kind of measures that we ask, okay, is a certain percentage going towards your own administration or salary, or depending on what your work is. And sometimes donors might say, how much gets through to the whoever's on the receiving end. So I'm not sure if that's the criticisms you've been reading there, but I think it falls into the category. By the way, a family, you know, that looks very much like gift giving can also not be, right? It's possible to imagine parents who use their children as instruments of their own self-interest, for example. You could imagine that situation, right? So I'm not giving the child a gift of an education, but my prestige in the community depends on the performance of my child, right? So even in the family structure, you can see what looks like a gift can shift, because we're talking about motivations often there. So does that answer what you're? Okay, thanks, Dan.
So at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned the three ideas of economic activity, that it's bad or that it's neutral, but you can work alongside it. And the example you gave of the third one was a company that uses profit to do charitable work. And that seemed very similar to the answer you ended up giving at the end, where you talked about, parents going to work to provide for their kids or to care for a sick relative. So how exactly does your answer differ from that third option of just it being the exchange being neutral, but then the thing that you do with your money, for example, being informed by charity, or are they basically the same?
Well, the first one was in the first part of the talk. The last one was in the third part of the talk. That's how they're different. No, it's a very good question, very perceptive. So what I was trying to talk about in that third category of a hybrid enterprise is that the objection that economic activity is either corrupting or neutral, or you operate in a parallel track, is that parallel track. So I go to work here, and then I do my philanthropy and charity over here. That one way is, another option is to actually, that I don't separate the two. They're separated conceptually, but they take place in the same area. So that would be the answer to that. But you're right, when I talked later about the motivation that charity fits into in the motivation, that's very easily transferable. That you say, I run a company, and actually this particular company is motivated by love of family, right? That's where it fits in, or to provide for others. Or it could be that I'm starting this enterprise because I love my town. And I think it's important that my town has employment, or that I love the whatever. You could, so on the motivational side, it can apply either on firms and so forth. That point I was trying to make there was, if you see economic activity as negative or neutral, then you can just take your charitable activity totally separate, or you could try and institutionalize it, but they're conceptually different in a hybrid enterprise. Is that?
So you keep it in mind as like a motivation.
No, you actually do the activities side by side. So you have, for example, a company that has a department that doesn't generate income for the department, like a big company has a community relations and they give grants.
So,
right?
So I hear your point, but this is precisely the point I was trying to make to Father Raymond, and why I think actually Catholic social teaching doesn't pay enough attention to its own theology. And it's a sense, I think there's an inherent, what you're pointing out is a bit of an inherent dualism between sort of the act of grace and the act of nature. You're sort of saying, well, economic exchange is practical stuff, and then you put this grace stuff on top of it. Where the Reformed theology, and I think your theology too, if you pay attention to the depth of it, is that the whole shooting match of nature is itself a gift. And nature itself, if you think about the creation story, was made out of love. So God makes the world because he loves it. He takes delight every day, right? I saw that it was very good, or good, and then at the very end it's a loving act. And his constant, so this is very theological, but his constant upholding it through his word is a constant act of love. And so the economic aspect of life, the frugal use of the resources that are given to us in gift, in order for the flourishing of the human being, whether it's through feeding them or what have you, is itself a type of justice, but it's what one is due, and the highest form of what one is due is love. Just as God, that's the point Augustine makes in his City of God, is that Rome was unjust because it didn't have its loves ordered properly. But if you order your loves properly, you give someone what they're due, and the highest order of that is love. And you see a picture of that economically, I would say, even in the scriptures in Isaiah 60, which is where Adam Smith got his title of his book, The Wealth of Nations. And it's this picture of everyone doing their work, trade, having children, ships of Tarshish, gold, camels, and so on. And they're all being brought to Jerusalem, to the temple. And so there's a sense in which the whole shooting match is formed by things made out of love, and the work is done in response to that love. And the point of it is to give love back to the person who gave it in the first place.
That's very impressive. I didn't know that. I learned something. I didn't know that the wealth of nations came from Isaiah 60.
Okay.
Do anybody else know that?
Yeah, Isaiah 60, it's a good passage. Very good.
No, yes, it's the word of God. It's a good passage. Oh,
Okay,
fantastic.
Andrea.
But I want to say something, but I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. No, did anybody else know that? Oh, very good, Brian.
The Reformed
Well,
people
it might be
we read our Bibles.
If
it's great.
oh, that's gratuitous. But if
That is gratuitous. That is gratuitous. You're welcome for that gift.
If anybody, if no one in this very intelligent room has heard of that, and only Brian knows it, it's possible Brian's mistaken. That's a possibility. But
I will bet $10 that I'm not.
There you go. But on that point, I would say that I think it was in the last talk, or maybe the second one, I addressed this a little bit in that I said we should be as impressed. In nature, we find it very easy to see. So we see the beauty of a flower. We see how intricate, life works together. And we have whole nature shows, and we just watch nature, and we're very impressed, and we see God's providence and God's creative and God's beauty. We see all that. And to your point, I think the point I made earlier was in the other lecture was that we ought to be able to see our economic life in that regard. The fact that I can, on my way home, stop in somewhere without telling anybody and purchase something that I want, and there's this massive network of cooperation between strangers that provides it, is a very impressive reality. I think it was 2 lectures ago I talked about that. And I think we probably we don't appreciate that enough. And that way of appreciating economic activity does lead to an engagement which is not aimed at giving gifts to others, right, as I was presenting it today, but aimed at I'm participating in already a cycle or a circle, maybe we should say a circle of gifts and exchange that has its roots in the Creator. And I didn't mention that, but I think that could be another way of saying that my economic activity, if I appreciate that, if I have that vision, I'm engaging in the same way when I engage in prayer or worship. I know I'm doing something directed towards the Creator. If I think of that economic life in that broader vision, we're all participating in this astonishing array in the same way that a tree, growing up, it reflects the glory of God. So to our economic life. So yeah, that's a good addition. Thank you,
Andrea, and then next. Yeah, Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, Father, I was just wondering what you make of like current DEI or ESG type movements that we see. Do you think that's a way of trying to cope with poor motivations or a lack of love, or to introduce a kind of love on like a system level in like the corporate sphere? I'm just wondering what you make of that.
Well, I think on the ESG business, so that stands for environment, social, and what's the G for? Governance. And both on the DEI and the ESG, sounds like kind of a children's song, doesn't it? I think what's going on there is that it turned out, and I must say in my own writing and thinking, I really did not appreciate at the time, and actually for some time after, what a cataclysmic event the financial crisis of 2007-8 was. My field is culture and economics, and I didn't see it at the time. But I think that brought to very widespread appreciation that some of our most powerful economic institutions were not governed by the rules we thought governed them, right? And the most famous example of that was Alan Greenspan, 20 years chairman of the Fed, who said, look, he was one of the leading economists of his generation. And he said, I just never thought that companies would take risks like this because it's not in their self-interest to do so. But more broadly than the pure economic model, a lot of people began to think, my goodness, these very powerful economic actors have interests that are not congruent with the common good. And it turned out when they did risky things that caused a lot of people a lot of pain, they arranged matters so that they didn't have to pay the price for that, which is actually true, which makes it a more devastating criticism because it's true. And so in response to that, I think what you found was the corporate world saw a crisis of legitimacy coming. The first eruption of that was the Occupy Wall Street movement and the 1%. But there's other things that started. That was on the left, and the things came on the right. And so the response was, how do we show that we're good citizens? And so the move became to do things that were very visible. Commitments to the environment, social progress, internal governance, that was a little bit more on accountability, diversity, equity, to show that we're good citizens, because we've been proven to be bad citizens. That's what actually it showed. They were bad citizens. They were corrupting the common good. They were using the system for their own benefit. And that was actually seen by the mass population more clearly than it actually was seen by people who should have seen it, And so I think that motivated that. Now, there is an older tradition that goes beyond the ESG DEI, where to be a good corporate citizen, you'll find that 100 years ago, the idea was that there should be some element of contributing to the common good for love of country, love of place, love of workers, whatever it might be. So that would be an older tradition. And that tradition, I think, is a more noble aspiration. It fits into more of what I was talking about. But I think that the response of the last 10, 15 years was motivated by a crisis of legitimacy when they were exposed as sacrificing the common good for their private interest. Interestingly, as we grow distant from that, both the ESG and DEI agendas seem to have lost some of them. I'm not saying they're not influential, but they seem to have lost some of their momentum, much more on the first one, ESG. A lot of those, some very prominent companies have just said, we're not doing that anymore. But it might not be that they've become more enlightened. It's just that the crisis is now 15 years in the past.
Okay, we have a question here, and then I think in the back after this. I will note just Desjardins, the credit union, was actually first started by a Catholic, Alphonse Desjardins, and he started that, and he actually built the value chain, not just a DEI department, but actually built his financial value chain to get at the needs of working class, particularly French-speaking working class people in Ottawa, who were not being paid and having to go to payday lenders and high interest usury, and he effectively says we can do better than this, and he built the credit union Desjardins, which is still one of the bigger players in finance today. So it's an example of Catholic.
Canada is a very interesting, because Canada in the eastern, in the French part of our country, the Caisse Populaires were started by religious motivation, and the western part of our country, the credit unions were started by, you know, prairie social gospel populists. So Canada has a very interesting tradition. That might be, to go back to the earlier question, a little bit of an example of a corporate entity that's motivated by such an explicitly, in this case, religious, but charitable, if you want to say, philanthropic motivation.
This might defy any education I may have displayed earlier, but I'm going to say it anyway. So I'm just thinking, practically speaking, this charity and distribution, is it always, like, when you see it, is it on the local level? I'm thinking of Amazons and all these big tech places and all this stuff, then these corporations that we have, and you're saying, okay, but it's in the distribution point that we have this charity displayed. How does that even happen with, let's say, Amazon, besides our guys coming with a smiling box to the door, in this gift giving?
Right. So I just have to clarify. So the term distribution is John Mueller's term for how goods are distributed.
Yes,
But it doesn't,
not the Amazon guy
it's not the
coming.
same as a distribution company or logistics company.
Right, right.
And the reason he chooses that term is because in the biblical way of looking at things, the principal way goods are distributed is in marriage, right? So in the, you know, for example, Jesus talking about in the days of Noah, they're eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage. Eating and drinking is consumption and associated production and exchange. Marriage is the principal form of distribution, right? Of gift giving. So Mueller means very specifically by distribution, not exchanges. So gift giving. So anything that would be, I mean, any economic activity, any exchange is distributing goods because they're going from one agent to another agent. But he means specifically by distribution, he means gift. So that's why I use the dinner party example and not a delivery example of goods. So today we have distribution is a huge, in the digital world, has achieved a huge prominence where we didn't think before, because before we actually thought that I went to the store and I got something, and we didn't really think too much about how the store got there. So if you said, who distributed those goods? Oh, I got it myself, right? That's why in the old days, when Jimmy Hoffa was trying to explain the importance of Teamsters, he would say, if you got it, a truck brought it, right? That was his big slogan. Today, we're more aware of that because the truck now comes to or if you got it, a van brought it or something, right? We have a sense of that. But that's why I don't mean distribution in that sense of the of distribution companies.
Motivation on the I mean, you kind of touched on it in the before question, the one right before this, but on that corporate level, even something in this tech sense where you have these tech companies and things like that now who are all online and who have these kind of.
Well, it could be. I mean, maybe it's not where you're going, but I could see that you could have an argument that, I mean, a lot of tech sector innovation, some of it is driven purely by a commercial motivation. Mm-hmm. But a lot of tech sector innovation starts off with somebody saying, there's a problem, I want to connect. So one of my favorite examples is in rural India, where, you know, someone would come by to get the produce from these small scale farmers and would tell them, this is what I'm paying. And that they didn't know. So the only way they could know what another price was to transport it to the village. And there's a cost in that. And if they got there and it was the same price as they were offered, they'd wasted this money. Now, somebody, I don't know who, has developed an app, so they now can see all the prices around. So they know whether it's worth going to the market, and that means that the price, it's an information, they're overcoming an information problem. And there's a lot of that in the tech sector. Some of it is very valuable, but a lot of the motivation is actually very, if you want to say, philanthropic, or it's motivated by high ideals, right? Not everything in the tech sector is that, of course, but there's a lot of that. So you could argue that the motivational dimension for people getting involved is to provide, well, in the older technology, access to credit, but today access to information, mainly access to information. And so I could see that a lot of people in the digital sector actually have very high ideals, and they think that they're serving some good for that.
We will not mention whether Facebook is using exchange to make money, but that's another thing altogether. We have, we're going to go with a last question here, if that's
Right,
okay.
okay.
We're at 8 o'clock, so this will be our last question. But the last public question, afterwards we can all pigeonhole Father Raymond.
Just maybe more of a clarification than anything, but when you're saying that most of the economy is based on gift giving, and even like that you have your job because you want to give good stuff to your kids, I can sort of see that on an individual level, but at some point it kind of like, okay, everybody at the gravel pit who's driving a dump truck in the gravel pit is doing it purely for self-sacrificial reasons, but the gravel pit as a gravel pit does not exist for self-sacrifice. It exists to produce gravel. As does the shipyard making ships, as does the steel rolling mill, all the rest of it. So at some point it becomes like diffuse or whatever, and then you're just back to exchange, right?
Well, the the difficulty, or what you're pointing out as difficulty there in the model, is that charity is by nature personal, right? So, can you have a charitable corporation? You can have a corporation that does philanthropic things, but can you have a charitable corporate? Charity really is so much tied up with a personal motivation. So it's very easy to say, you could say correctly that everybody who works at the gravel pit, everybody, not just the drivers, but everybody who works there is motivated by charity to provide for others. But the gravel pit itself, although it's a legal person, it's not an actual person. So the gravel pit itself doesn't really have an interest except the interest of continuing in being, which requires a profit, right? So that's a fair criticism, is to say that the gravel pit itself doesn't have a purpose. So if I'd asked, the point of the question I was trying to get at is that where do we find gift giving? We actually find it in the motivations of individuals. But you're correct to point out that a corporation, specifically a firm, wouldn't have a charitable purpose. It doesn't have a soul, right? It has a legal personality, but it doesn't have a soul. So if you're not interested in charity, you don't need to go through this whole kind of long rigmarole that we've done this evening. But if you're a Christian, you have to be interested in charity. But the charity pertains to individuals, and where can they find it in their life? Because at the end of the day, the individuals are the ones who are judged on charity, not the firm. Doesn't have a judgment in that sense.
Thank you, Father Raymond. There's so much more to discuss, but let's give him a round of applause. So just a few things to note. One is that if you enjoyed this and you enjoyed thinking about economics in this way, I would encourage you to join Cardus, our work in economics program, which is headed up by our program director in the back, Mr. Nauta there. He does great work on this every day, and you can actually sign up and follow his newsletters and his work. You've probably seen him in the news recently talking about the working class and other things like that. So I would encourage you to sign up and follow us along for that. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that Cardus is actually hosting something that we are calling the Exchange. We didn't plan this ahead of time, but Cardus Exchange, which will be happening on April 10th through 12th. We'll be having other speakers coming in. We'll be having Jason Kenney come in to talk about what does it mean to have Canada as a home. We'll have Karen Ristoul and Jean-Christophe Jasmin, who are an Indigenous woman and a Quebec nationalist, engage with Mr. Kenney on that. We're going to have a discussion about pluralism and what does it mean when differences are in the home. We'll have Joanna Barron, Sean Spear, and a number of others. So we'd encourage you to join us for that. If you go to cardus.ca/events, you'll find that. And we do like the exchange of ideas in love, because there's got to be truth and love and all of that as well. So that's the second thing. The third thing is Cardus is a charity. And so if you find yourself doing very well in your business, we would always welcome gifts from you to help us keep the light on and to pay for the beer. And the last thing is, please drink that beer. It's there for you. It is a gift, and it helps facilitate the exchange of ideas. So let's enjoy, and thank you all so much for coming tonight.